Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. You're very welcome to the International Energy Agency's webinar today, The Voice of Labour in Our Inclusive Energy Future. We thank you for joining us. And to commence proceedings, it's my pleasure to hand the floor to the Executive Director of the IEA, Dr. Fatih Birol. Dr. Birol, please.
Dear colleagues, greetings to all of you from IEA headquarters in Paris. It is my pleasure to welcome you, all of you, to our event today. Our event has a wonderful name, The Voice of Labour in Our Inclusive Energy Future. This is an important event for us, I guess for all of you, because we say clean energy is for and about people. We know that the clean energy has a lot of potential to create many, many jobs in different parts of our economies. But if those clean energy policies are not rightly designed, it may have implications for different communities and different countries. It is the reason why I have convened a high-level commission on people-centered clean energy transition early this year. I am thankful to Prime Minister of Denmark and many of you joining to this commission. And this commission is run by the Danish Energy Minister Dan Jorgensen, co-chaired by the Minister of Senegal, Madame Sophie Gladima. What we aim to do in this commission, and there is a huge interest from the business, from the labor, from the economy, from governments about this commission's deliberations, we hope to come up with a series of recommendations for COP26 later this year. I just wanted to tell you that we received a good news just yesterday, in fact, a new addition to our Commission, who is a great honor for us to have Cardinal Peter Turkson, who works in the Vatican directly with Pope Francis as prefect of the Dicastery for Promotion of Integral Human Development, and he is a key thinker on environmental and social issues. We are honored that he has agreed to join our commission. We are holding a number of webinar discussions among the Commission members and other colleagues in different subjects to get their input for our deliberations. And this one, today's one, is particularly important for me. I have asked my colleague Brian Motherway, who is heading our efforts here, we should have a specific event on labor, because labor must be central to our discussions on clean energy transitions. Now, we know that the clean energy transitions will end up with a lot of transformation in our economy, industry, and in our societies. And it is the reason we are very careful that the policies of the governments are designed carefully and planned for and put in place to support the people that are or that might be affected in the future. And as such, we believe social dialogue is an essential part of this planning. And here, we are going to advise governments as International Energy Agency to engage with labor, trade unions directly in order to design the right clean energy policies. Now, there is a word everybody talks about, we all use it. It's become a cliche, but it is, I think, a living cliche that nobody needs to be left behind. It is more so in this context. Today, we are going to hear from many leading thinkers how to address these issues robustly and fairly. We are looking forward to learning from their wisdom and experience. Today, I want to thank all of you and a lot of colleagues who are listening, following this event. And I would like to especially thank our chairwoman, Madam Chair, the first part of the event, Ambassador Muriel Pénicaud. Merci beaucoup, Madame Ambassador. Madame Ambassador is the permanent representative of France to the OECD, but she has a distinguished career. She was, between 2017 to 2020, she was the French Minister of Labor, where she led several structural reforms leading to a significant decrease of unemployment and inequality. She is also a member of our Global Commission on People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions, and I am very pleased that she has agreed to join us today to chair the very first session. Madam Ambassador, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol, dear Fatih. First, I would like to let you know that the event is available both in French and English. So usually I speak in French as a French ambassador, but today as I'm chairing the first session, I think it will be easier for everyone. So I will speak in English. You have two channels, so I think you got all the information on that. Just before we start debating with the panelists, I would like to share very shortly my views. I think we all agree here in this webinar that climate crisis is an existential threat for all humans. We cannot save the planet without saving the humans, and vice versa. For that, nobody should be left behind by the transition. We cannot accept the idea that there could be winners and losers. If the transition is perceived by some as a threat, then it will jeopardize its success. So solidarity is not an option, it's needed. The goal of the Commission is to anticipate and to act on the social and human impact of the transition towards clean energy. It's clear that this transition will impact lives, jobs, behaviors, revenues, the way we produce, the way we consume, the way we travel, the way we work, and the way we live, and also livelihoods of people. So this Commission will produce recommendations to the COP26 in Glasgow next November. And as a former business executive and as a former Minister of Labour, I'm deeply convinced that we cannot elaborate this recommendation without building them on social dialogue. Social dialogue is key to address all these human and social stakes. We need to dare, we need to collective breakthrough to face this challenge. The good news is that the transition will create much more jobs than it will destroy. But we have to be realistic. Not the same type of jobs, not at the same place, not necessarily, and not necessarily for the same people. If we don't invest massively in upskilling, reskilling, helping everyone to get opportunities of this change and not to be a victim. It's why labor unions are key, and our key constituency representing the voice of working people to help to engage workers and communities as active participants in this clean energy transition. People must be at the heart of the clean energy transition, and we are here to discuss how. It's why today's seminar and webinar is very important to make our recommendation the most practical, the most operational possible. And I thank by advance all the speakers for contributing to this collective ambition for and with people everywhere in the world. It's time now to go to our panel, and you will have the pleasure to hear Sharon Birol, who is the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, Jorge Rivera-Staff, the Energy Secretary of Panama, Martha Houghton, who is the Deputy Director General of Policy at the ILO, International Labour Organization, Shoya Yoshida, who is the General Secretary at the International Trade Union Confederation for Asia Pacific, and Brad Markell, Executive Director, AFL-CIO of Industrial Union Council. So I will turn first to another member of the Global Commission, Sharon Birol. We know from a while, we have done things together, and I know you will have a strong voice on that. Mrs. Birol is the former president of the Australian Council of the Trade Unions, ACTU, a position she served for 10 years. She is the first woman to become General Secretary of the ITUC since its foundation in 2006. And the ITUC is the most representative international trade union organization, representing the interest of all working people globally, effectively representing 200 million workers in 163 countries and territories with 332 national affiliate organizations. Dear Sharon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Pennico, and indeed I'm delighted to join you and other members of the Commission. I can't stress enough that this Commission's recommendations will be so very timely, and I want to appreciate up front the leadership from Denmark and Senegal. We've seen the leadership of Denmark in Europe, particularly around the move to clean energy with wind, but also always with a social lens. And we desperately need to see the demands and the leadership of indeed countries like Senegal, who are looking to lead the way in developing contexts where we also need to see global support. As I said, the recommendations on the practical guidelines of how to implement just transition, how to make sure we leave nobody behind, this is now vital. The history of just transition is known to you all. The Union's campaign for more than a decade to have this commitment in the Paris Climate Agreement, but of course a commitment without implementation is indeed not going to get us to the inclusive, clean energy future we want. So now, of course, we have to see that every country, every industry looks to make sure that just transition is at the heart of what we know has to be an ambition to actually put the planet on a stable footing that is probably more challenging than any other systemic change in our history. We've seen a number of them. We know many of them have not been just, but this one needs to be, not just because it's about people, although that should be enough, but because it's also about the timeframes in which we have to achieve change. We have to get to emissions reductions that are more than half of those necessary to get to net zero by 2050, by 2030. If you're going to make such a massive change in all of our industries with clean energy as a foundation by 2030, then the only way we can do it is if we have indeed not just ambition, but trust. And trust can only come from the transparency of just transition agreements, where people can see themselves as part of a secure future. Now, the global UN framework on just transition, with indeed the ILO guidelines at the centre, outline the principles and, of course, the importance of social dialogue and bargaining for agreements that workers and their families can understand and therefore can build trust. But the central message here is that if every industry has to transition, then unions must be at the table with governments and employers, either separately or together, depending on the circumstances, making decisions about the transition and being able to make those transparent, preferably through agreements, and actually advocate them to workers. This is not an easy process. Whether it's exiting from coal, which is particularly painful for workers and their unions, or indeed it's a shift in the industry sector from fossil fuels to clean energy, this is an absolute set of challenges, but it doesn't stop there. We need every industry to transition. We need to make sure that clean energy is indeed the foundation of that, but it requires many changes to our practices, to the way in which companies see their future. And I'm proud to say that on a clean energy base, we've just had more than 200 tonnes of steel produced in Sweden that are emissions free. Now, that's a remarkable transition, but it won't get us a clean steel industry if, in fact, we aren't sharing technology, making sure that those innovations and the industry policy necessary are protected. Certainly, Europe is looking at this through its carbon border adjustment mechanism, but we need to make sure that even with those commitments to industry policy, that it's inclusive, that not only are people at the table, but in fact that the transparency allows the sharing of technology so everybody benefits from development. We are optimistic. Indeed, Muriel said it, but there are jobs in the transition. We've got to be careful that they're secure, union jobs, good wages, decent work, and of course, protected by health and safety, that fundamental rights are respected. But we also need to make sure that we understand the nature of the jobs, what's possible to protect or transition, what you need by way of reskilling, what you actually need by way of redeployment, and of course, where the income support is to make that possible. Let me give you, first of all, the very simple set of ambitions, really, that Just Transition has to focus on. The first is that if you genuinely believe nobody can be left behind, then we have to make sure all workers are secure. For older workers, if they're to be displaced, then we need secure pensions. Where they're slightly younger than retirement age, but they choose early retirement, secure bridges to pensions. So those people who've served our economies well, who've built their communities, actually know that they have a secure future. For younger workers, it means income support. It means support for reskilling and, of course, for redeployment. Because if you look at the jobs, then again, you know, Muriel was right. They won't all be in the same place, even if they're in the same industry, and some will probably not be in the same industry. But to give you a sense of the potential for clean energy, for every 10 renewable energy jobs, 5 to 10 are created in supply chains. And if they're good jobs, union jobs, decent work with just wages, then you get up to 30 to 35 in the broader economy. That's a just development framework that's worth having for the individuals themselves, but of course for the broader economic stability that we seek. And of course, the final piece is we need to know that communities will be supported. We've seen communities simply left abandoned by other transitions. If you can't locate the energy source or the industry source that exists today in that community, we must have community renewal plans. And while it's critical that in the transition of workplaces, then unions are at the table, it's also critical in community renewal that unions work with the civil society to actually make it possible. When you look at living cities, then the challenge of livable cities, then unions and community have to work together, and we have to see that the investment is there for the energy base of clean energy, but also for the circular economy, for the capacity to build jobs in related areas of recycling, reuse, and waste management, all of which are dependent on energy, and that must be clean energy. So I would simply say to you, having the timeline for these recommendations, being the COP as a target, is really good because it's time-bound and it's actually going to put the practical guidance in place for that the governments and of course the stakeholder, the social partners, to actually understand what has to be done. But I am going to leave you with some good news. That is, yesterday I was talking to the UN Secretary General's team, and he's really committed to having a major high-level national government-involved forum where they challenge governments to present their just transition plans, to actually show how they're engaging labour and where it's relevant civil society, and to work to make sure that the timeline and the ambition that comes from those is delivered. So we say thank you to the UN, thank you to the ILO, Marta, because already the ILO is also doing what they can to build partnerships. But there is no doubt that I'm committed to this commission, and I know my colleagues will be, to see that we get that practical guidance for governments, for companies, for the involvement that must have social dialogue and collective bargaining at its heart.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Birol, Sharon, for these very insightful remarks. I think for the debate, you put some very, very important points on the table. The timeline, how to make the ambition realistically in place when we have a time with very constrained. The role of ILO and UN, and new cooperation between international organizations, I would say. The just transition agreements, which would be new types of agreement in a way, and ILO can support that, I guess. Making decisions from as well government, unions and employers' point of view. And you enlighten the condition of success. The job strategy, because there are redeployment, upskilling, reskilling, and the whole supply chain is involved. Securing social benefits, starting by pension, and also having new kind of cooperation between unions and civil society to involve communities. I think that's very, very inspiring. And I will give the baton now and turn to the Secretary of Energy from Panama, Mr. Rivera-Staff. Mr. Rivera-Staff has been the National Energy Secretary of Panama since 2 years. He has more than 10 years of experience advising governments and private companies on legal, regulatory and public policy issues in the energy sector. Under his leadership, Panama has become a global champion for the UN high-level dialogue on energy and a member of the Global Commission also. Thank you very much, Secretary, for your leadership on this very important issue. And please, I invite you now to share your thoughts with us.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone in the panel, all the colleagues, Ambassador Penicot and Dr. Birol. We are really very pleased to have this opportunity to share some ideas, not only from the government perspective on energy transitions, but also this perspective from a developing country that is so important. What are we doing? What are we fulfilling right now? And we're committed with the process, and I want to state this, to reinforce this idea of a process. Transition is a process, and we are working on that to give the opportunities, and we have developed a roadmap for the country for this process, for authorities, for citizens, and of course for the companies. Human beings have radically transformed 25% of the planet's nature, and we estimated that by 2050, under current trends, only 10% of nature will remain. We have the data right here. We have to act accordingly to avoid this future. A just and job-rich energy transition need to be anchored in comprehensive policies addressing macroeconomic and industrial policies, skills needs, social protection for those negatively impacted, and gender and inclusion dimensions, all based and supported by social dialogues to structure transformations that facilitate a labor mobility path without social disruption. We are convinced that innovation energy policies, innovation accelerating energy transition is the way to boost green jobs as a cornerstone to sustainable development and social inclusion. Policy interventions and investments for stimulus and recovery are leading to a paradigm shift on Panama energy system that in turn can underpin a more resilient economy and society. Investing in energy transformation can heavily influence future socioeconomic development through creating synergies across social, economic, and environmental indicators in Panama. Our national cabinet is engaged in fostering the National Energy Transition Agenda at all levels that was approved last November. In development on this agenda, last February, we established the National Energy Transition Council as a space to serve an advisory committee where 8 of the 17 high-level members of this commission comes from the private energy and non-energy sector, including energy consumers and academia. Therefore, understanding systemic outcomes of action and inaction is essential to inform policy making. This holistic approach with the energy transition at the heart will bring together economic development and employment, meeting climate goals and social well-being. This energy transition will pay for itself. The benefit result of Panama's energy transition outweighed the cost. By redirecting investments towards this transition, Panama will achieve higher return on investment compared to current plans, creating new employment more than the risk of job losses with the right policy frameworks in place in the short term and beyond. Over 2020 to 2050 period, for every $1 million that Panama invests in decarbonizing its energy sector, we think that we could create 2.5 new additional jobs on a permanent basis. This energy transition agenda will improve our economic reactivation, generating additional 490 million of GDP, more than 560,000 million in savings for the government, and more than 19,000 people will not suffer respiratory diseases. All these numbers just by 2024. Additionally, we'll create around 15,000 new green jobs for this year, this period, until 2024. This around 0.5% more job creation than under the business as usual scenario in just 3 years. We have to put this as a specific mention. We have developed this policy called Energy Transition Agenda, but also we have developed an economic impact of this transition agenda with the support of the European Union and the United Nations Environmental Agency. And this report is a key tool for us to establish this road that we have to go ahead. With these numbers, we can put together more the decision-making process more accurate, and we can go ahead with specific tasks under the short term, medium, and long term. Direct employment is higher in the short term when investments are first implemented. Indirect employment, creation increases steadily as economic gains accumulate over time. In 2024, new jobs created by transition-related technology are highest for charging infrastructure, for example, for electric vehicles and renewable power generations. These two categories together account for more than 80% of the additional direct employment created. 90% of the additional direct jobs created in the renewable energy sector correspond to solar, photovoltaic, and wind. Concerning indirect jobs in both low carbon scenarios, 28% of new jobs are found in the industry and the remaining 72% in the service sector. These additional jobs emerge by supporting the creation of the domestic value chain for transition-related technologies. The energy transition, country context customized, aligned with national priorities, local culture and context, provides many opportunities to create local value chain in alignment with Panama's strategic industrial goals. Enterprise will need well-trained workers equipped with the right set of skills to reduce their carbon footprint. They will need to invest preparing their workers for new and challenging technology change, making the workplace a place for continuous learning for sustainable performance. To accelerate this, we have within our recovery package, we're developing industrial policies, training, and educational programs aimed to build local supply chains which can be integrated in global supply chains, and developing the skills and competence needed across industries to adapt to this transformation. We're implementing memorandum of understanding and programs to strengthen capacities and energy transition with our National Institute of Vocational Training, with our Institution of Technological Superior Education, with the University of Panama, with the University of Technology of Panama. We have launched a mobile educational classroom for solar technology training nationwide, including a training program focused on women at social risk. We also are preparing a formal permanent school in Panama to train indigenous women as photovoltaic system installers and managers. Panama is strengthening the existing industrial sector in the development of coherent labor market policies that accelerate the transformation by matching demand with supplies. Finally, that's why last March, we launched the construction process of the Women Energy Nexus Roadmap, aiming to build up the public policy required to enable conditions to foster gender equity, both within and outside the energy sector, having as a goal to create an open agreement for gender equity in the energy transition agenda implementation. Next week, for example, we're also launching the energy sector labor equity survey to properly dimension the current gender gap and manage the appropriate mechanisms to ensure that at least women occupy 50% of the jobs generated by the energy transition at all levels with the same income condition as men. Furthermore, we launched the SDG 7 Academy for Youth Leadership on Sustainable Energy with the support of 19 energy transition national and international, we call it godmothers and godfathers of these youth leaders, to assure generational succession on this endeavor. During the energy transition, many new jobs will surface and evolve. To assure bringing everybody to the transition, communication to transform knowledge in job opportunity lays on all of us. The future is not a specific moment that we wait right now. We build our future and we're building it together now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary Rivera staff. I think it's great to hear the work Panama has been doing, is planning to do. Some key ambitions you have, I think, are very important for our debate. Transition is a process. We have to work on the process, not only on the goal, but on the process to go there. Second, technology innovation is part of the energy transition agenda. It's a big part. And if I may say, probably social innovation too. Third one, the energy transition is a lever for development, but also additional jobs creation, and especially in renewable energy and industry. And four, investing in continuous learning in all manners at the workplace is key, and including the relation with the focus on women to support women leadership and gender equality. I think it's extremely inspiring for the debate. May I remind all the speakers, please, that you have 7 minutes, if possible. And now it's my pleasure to turn to Martha Newton. She's the Deputy Director General for Policy of the ILO. Mrs. Newton joined the ILO in September last year after a career at the United States US Department of Labor, most recently as Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs. In this position, she led the formulation of international economic, trade and labor policy and programs focused on international child labor, forced labor and modern slavery. You have a great experience, Mrs. Newton, and I think it's important for us to now to hear the remarks you have on this topic.
And thank you so much, Ambassador, and it's good to see you again, and honorable ministers, distinguished colleagues, Dr. Birol, and ladies and gentlemen. It's really an honor to be here today to have this very important conversation on an inclusive energy future. You know, I think over the past year and a half of the pandemic, I really believe that we've all had opportunity to reflect about the kind of life we want and what type of world we want to build. You know, during the pandemic, the decline in economic activity, mobility, and international trade has led to a temporary reduction in CO2 emissions, you know, falsely suggesting that socioeconomic and environmental aspirations cannot coincide. And to the contrary, it's clear that economic growth, decent work creation, and environmental action can and must go hand in hand, and the energy sector is key in this transition. Yes, it's true, some jobs will become obsolete, but by far, most jobs will be replaced or transformed, and as many as 20 million additional jobs can be created by 2030, only by investing in renewable energy, energy sufficiency, and sustainable mobility. And such investments can also reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 14%. You know, the nature of oil and gas exploration projects means that the industry relies much more heavily on capital equipment than human labor. And while the oil and gas sector alone makes up about 2.2% of the global economy, it is estimated to directly employ about 6 million people. And even though it may not be a labor-intensive sector, it doesn't mean that we can ignore the people and the lives that will be affected by the clean energy shift. So it's important that a human-centered energy transition must focus primarily on two things: the people and the economy. So the International Monetary Fund has found that investing in clean energy can have an impact on GDP 2 to 7 times greater than investments in non-sustainable forms of energy. And I should add that the recent report by the IEA, the Net Zero by 2050, a roadmap for the global energy sector, also demonstrates that there's a pathway to net zero that is cost-effective and economically productive. So when it comes to employment and people, we must ensure that decent work remains central and that workers' incomes and people's livelihoods are protected. But however, you know, a just and human-centered energy transition does not happen by itself. It requires dedicated action and measures. So I want to quickly just focus on 3 items in the actions and measures category. And some of them you've heard, it's kind of a common theme. But first, investments and financial commitment. Second, skilling and reskilling. And lastly, to tie it all together, the importance of social dialogue and just transition planning. The response to the COVID-19 pandemic has given rise to an unprecedented level of public spending across the world. However, as it takes shape, the current pattern of the COVID recovery investment is not following a green path. In fact, of the almost $15 trillion pledged by governments for post-pandemic recovery, less than 1/5 has been directed towards green initiatives. Last month at the International Labor Conference, we adopted a global call to action for a human-centered recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, which calls for action that's socially inclusive and the importance of a green recovery. And similar calls have been made at the G20 and the G7, but we now need to act on them. Therefore, investments are crucial for sustainable energy transition. Secondly, skills and reskilling, the common theme that we've heard. If we want to reap the employment and economic benefits from the energy transition, we will need, and Ambassador Pinnico, you indicated in your opening remarks, to put people at the center of our plans. And this includes investing in education, skills and reskilling of future and existing workers. Persistent skills gap lead to underemployment and staggering growth. So improved collaboration across labor, education, energy, and planning ministries is really important in securing that the right heads and the right hands for the future labor energy market. And let us remember, equally important is the involvement of employers and workers organizations. And I'm so glad to see Sharon Birol and the ITUC a part of this discussion today. As always, we know that making decisions and plans in collaboration with the real economy actors yields far more robust and consensual and lasting transformation. And this leads me to my very last important argument for social dialogue and policy planning. Here we focus on making people and companies key actors in the energy transition. While energy transition is a complex task, we know that social dialogue leads to more resilient social economic policies. So therefore, the ILO tripartite constituents, governments, labor unions, and employer organizations have developed the guidelines for a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all, which present a clear roadmap for how governments can couple climate action with social transformation. And these guidelines are essential and useful starting point for policy planning. And I'm so glad to hear, Sharon, of the conversation that you had with the Director General, because the Just Transition Guidelines lay out concrete policy areas for intervention for growth, industrial and sectoral enterprise, skills, occupational safety and health, social protection, labor market rights, and social dialogue and tripartism. The pandemic has shown that if governments want, they can rapidly scale up social protection for furloughed workers and the unemployed. This helped economies across the globe to prevent social unrest, economic crisis, and aid in the recovery. But the same is needed for a rapid energy transition. To make it just, social protection measures should be put in place to protect incomes, ensure career development, and enable a structural transformation to net zero economies. And Minister Rivera, it was good to hear about the roadmap that Panama has put in place. Your country's putting in place strategies for success, and we encourage other countries to follow the holistic approach that you've described. So we only have a few months until the UN COP26, and this will be a decisive moment. As a growing number of key countries bring forward their commitments to net zero, the long-term direction is becoming clear, but we can't lose track of the short to medium-term plans, which are nationally determined contributions. All of the aspects of a just and human-centered energy transition that I've outlined today need to be firmly embedded in those plans if we're to achieve scale and speed. And lastly, the international system is stepping up. We here at the ILO are working with a range of partners to spearhead the Climate Action for Jobs initiative. It was launched in 2019 at the UN Climate Action Summit, and it's already rallied a coalition of 48 countries globally. Our initiative will support countries on bold solutions for a just transition with ambitious climate action that delivers on decent jobs and advances social justice. Please know that you can always count on the ILO as trusted partners in climate action and social change. We look forward to expanding our collaboration with all of you and to working on our common goals. So thank you again for having us participate, and I'm glad to be here for the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Newton, for this very open and extremely interesting perspective. I think you enlightened several topics which are very important. The first is that gas and oil sectors is based on an intensive capital economy more than people. And now we have to focus on people and new economic model. Second, in the action, you raised the point that all governments in the world and all international community, a lot, we are investing a lot to manage the crisis. And you made a call to invest as much to prepare the future, if I interpret what you said, saying that now we need a huge investment, especially in skills and reskilling, but not only to invest, also to measure, to be sure we make progress, and of course to invest also in the trust that will help the social dialogue and the tripartite dynamic of ILO to be really powerful, to face these challenges. And the guidelines of ILO will be very important of that. It's very interesting to see also that today we have unions, we have ILO, we have IEA, and there are many international, and we mentioned UN. We need a coalition of everyone, with all organizations to succeed. And of course, to prepare the COP26, we absolutely need this question of people to be in the debate. It cannot be just for unions or HR specialists. It's the question of everyone. I would like now to turn to Mr. Yoshida. Mr. Shoya Yoshida is the General Secretary of the Asia Pacific branch of the ITUC, and he has been serving in his position since 4 years. The Asia Pacific branch of ITUC represents more than 60 million members and almost 60 trade union centers in 34 countries and territories in Asia Pacific region. Prior to joining this organization, you served as the Executive Director for the International Affairs Department of the Japanese Trade Union Confederation. So as well as the Asia Pacific level than Japan, you have a huge experience that can help us to understand what we should do now. So please, Mr. Yoshida, please share your thoughts now.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. My region, the region of the Asia and the Pacific, is the world's largest and fastest growing energy consumer, as well as the largest producer of carbon dioxide. In the recent months, China, Japan, and South Korea have committed to achieve the carbon neutrality by the middle of this century. So this implies that the innovative change will occur in Asian energy sector, and this could be an important catalyst for decarbonization in the region as a whole. There is an urgent need to establish an overall policy framework to achieve both the decarbonized society and maintain the current economic growth. Such a framework not only includes an energy policy, but also macroeconomic and growth policies, industrial, sectoral policies, and enterprise policies. In addition, we need a social and economic measures to minimize the negative impact on employment and the local economy, and at the same time maximize opportunities to create decent work, decent and climate-friendly jobs, such as skill development, occupational health and safety, social protection, and active labor market policies. So we need a just transition. A just transition should be the goal of our actions as well as a process to achieve our goals. Let me introduce the 3 demands for workers for just transition: social dialogue, investment, and inclusion. Social dialogue must be promoted at all stages, from policy design to implementation and also evaluation, and all levels from global, national, and to enterprise level. In this way, consensus or agreement can be reached on pathways toward environmental sustainability with decent work. For example, the executive order was signed by President Biden of the United States immediately after he took office. This order directs his team to consider the views of trade unions and to seek input from workers through trade unions. However, unfortunately, very unfortunately, social dialogue in our region is not functioning well. For example, ILO Convention 87, Freedom of Association, and Convention 98 on right to bargain collectively are instrument for government to create a stable political climate in which trade unions can operate without fear of reprisal. However, only half of the ILO member states have ratified Convention 87, and only 2/3 have ratified Convention 98. These conditions constitute a serious hindrance for trade unions in creating an equal footing with government and employers. Investment. Financial authorities need to promote private investment by effectively utilizing public funds as leverage. For example, by using risk-reducing finance to encourage the use of private funds. In addition, investment and financing for climate change countermeasures and renewable energy must be promoted. Let me introduce the work of trade union movement or international trade union movement, so-called workers' capital. We work with national trade unions to facilitate the investment of pension reserves made up of contribution by and for workers in order for private companies to build long-term value and drive the integration of environmental, social, and governance issues in their decision making. And last, inclusion. A just transition should be inclusive in terms of strengthening the engagement of developing countries. Each country must contribute fairly to achieve the goal of Paris Agreement. Therefore, international cooperation is particularly necessary in the area of financing in parallel with cooperation in sharing and transferring environmental technologies such as renewable energy. For example, the EU has established the Just Transition Fund to provide grant for their member states, those who are most affected by the green transition, to make Europe climate neutral by 2050. The Asian Development Bank, ADB, is committed to delivering $80 million in cumulative climate financing from its own resources by 2030, and for the least 75% of its operations by number of projects to future climate adaptation and mitigation initiative. So high-income countries over the world are encouraged to further contribute to the ADB, and also both private and public and private initiatives such as the Green Climate Fund, GCF, and the Global Environmental Facility, GEF. So let me conclude just by saying that there are no jobs on a dead planet. A just transition is a true test for the global community. We will work to ensure that no one is left behind. This is why we, trade union movement, fought and won the idea of just transition in the Paris Agreement, and why we continue to work on the new social contract for just transition through social dialogue. Thank you very much. Over to you, Madam Ambassador.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Mr. Yoshida. I think you raised several points were very complementary with what have been said already. First, that it's a question of quantity of jobs, but also a quality of jobs. And the question of decent work in a new model, because we are transitioning to a new model, is by design that we have to think of it. It's very difficult to repair. It's better to design the right way. Second, you mentioned that when we speak of social dialogue, and here we are all convinced that social dialogue will be a key of this transition, you insisted that it should be from the policy design to implementation and evaluation. I think it's very important to make the cycle of progress possible with the challenge of the ratification of ILO convention. And I agree with you, is not the same level of ratification everywhere in the world, and it will be probably one of the big stakes of ILO in the future. You mentioned also the importance of investment, both public and private, because we need all the initiatives. And of course, in the skills, I think we all agree that we need a huge investment in skills, like Panama is doing, like Europe intend to do, but still to do. And on the inclusion, nobody should be left behind. That should be in that, and I think you call for something that resonates for all of us. It's a new social contract for a new economic model based on clean energy. Finally, last but not least, I would like to introduce Brad Markell. So Brad Markell, you will have sorry, I lost my paper. Brad Markell, who is the executive director for the AFL-CIO, Industrial Union Council. The Industrial Union Council is comprised of 11 unions with over 2 million members, including nearly 1 million directly employed in the manufacturing sector. Mr. Markell has been serving as executive director for more than 10 years, so he has a large experience, and he also chaired the AFL-CIO Energy Task Force and advises the Biden-Harris US presidency team on behalf of the labor movement. So you will be very influential on the topic too, and Mr. Markell, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Madam Ambassador, and thank you to Dr. Birol for putting this together and inviting the AFL-CIO. It is the National Federation of Labor Unions in the United States, 55 unions, and almost 12.5 million members overall. I want to commend the IEA for this commission and the work that it's doing and the way it's being carried out. I think, as many people mentioned, we're at a moment where we have to accelerate our ambition, we have to go faster, and the social dialogue is the key to that. Clean energy policies can't be enacted in a vacuum and be successful at the pace we need them to be successful. They have to be enacted in a supporting suite of policies around social and economic and industrial policies, labor policies. And they could be different. They will be different in many places. In an OECD nation, it means one thing. In other nations, it means a completely different thing. It could be the energy and economic situation of the nation, the natural resources, the political system. The focus could be on good jobs. It could be on ending poverty and energy poverty. But the only way that we can have the voice of the people is to have an institutional voice for labor at the table, so that each of these different circumstances can be taken into account for nationally developed priorities. Unions and having people at the table, to use a US idiom, doesn't cut it. Unions are representative broadly of the working class. They have a democratic mandate. It's not just another NGO, it's a social partner on a level playing field at all times with business. So people in business means unions in business. I really want to bring up what Ms. Newton said about the ILO guidelines. I was a member of the committee that put those guidelines together. We spent almost 2 weeks in Geneva doing it. And believe me when I tell you that every line in that guideline has been well considered. And what IEA is bringing to the table, combining the technical expertise, the knowledge of the sectors, and the real roadmap, the technical roadmap on moving forward, means that there's going to be very powerful messages and very powerful ideas coming out of this commission. Just transition, as Sister Birol mentioned, really started with the labor movement some years ago, decades ago, as we realized what was going to happen in the energy sector when we had to fight climate change. It's not just a set of demands. Labor's pretty good at forming demands. It is actually a theory of change. It says when labor and civil society are at the table institutionally through unions, then change can happen faster. And if there's any place in this world that we live in where change needs to happen faster, is the fight against climate change. So this is not just something that we're asking, it's something that we're saying, if we want to be successful, we have to have social dialogue. You know, what does labor want? That's an age-old question. I will say that, you know, job quality, as my colleague mentioned, is a big deal. There's been a 40-year assault on workers and workers' institutions in the developed countries and all over the world. We have the highest inequality ever. We've got more precarious work than we ever had, and we've got a surfeit of quality jobs. That leaves workers in a position of saying, hey, every time there's a change, it doesn't work out very well for us. And this climate change issue feels like a big deal, and they're very fearful. For fossil fuel workers, where it's usually the sector is organized and they're very, very well paid, those fossil fuel workers know that they have the best job that they've ever had and probably ever will have. We have to dispel that notion. We have to make everybody feel confident that when we do the energy transition that we need to avoid the absolute looming disaster that is climate change, that is going to work out for them and their family and their communities. I'll just end with this example of the United States, where if you remember in 2018, the Green New Deal was unveiled by several people in our Congress, and there was a lot of resistance from unions to it because at that time period, nobody in the labor movement, nobody in the working class believed that they would have a seat at the table. It just wasn't possible in our system at that time. Joe Biden gets elected president. Unions have an explicit seat at the table. As Soya mentioned, the executive order that President Biden issued very early in his administration put unions at the table. It mentions unions 11 times. It uses the phrase well-paying union jobs 4 times. In April, President Biden announced that the United States was going to cut emissions 50% by 2030 as part of our NDC. With unions explicitly at the table, there was no pushback. There was acceptance. There were people joining in. You had union leaders appearing at the White House to support President Biden's plan. That's the difference that happens when unions are at the table and workers feel that their needs are going to be accommodated. Change and acceptance of change comes much more easily. That's really the goal of just transition. It's the goal of social dialogue. And that's why this IEA commission is so important, because it is really a chance to move the ball down the field, as we say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Merkel. I think you raised several very important points. First, the union representative it's not a kind of group of opinions. They represent the workers. They are part of the democratic system. It's a democratic mandate. Second, that you, as several colleagues, you insisted on the importance of ILO guidelines. I think to put the ILO guidelines somewhere through with the support of IEA in the COP26 debate, I think it's an ambition we should have. I don't know how, because it's usually parallel streams, but we need them to converge. Third, you said, I think it's also a motto which can be important. It's social dialogue. Social dialogue is not an addition in this topic. It's a condition of success, and especially because by experience, many workers fear the change, as you say, and I can tell you that it's true in many countries, including mine. And if they feel it's a threat because we don't organize, that it becomes a chance, an opportunity, then we'll have an issues for workers and communities. So I think how to make this social dialogue at the heart of the system, to have people being able to trust that the just transition means it's meant for them. It's quite obvious to say, and I think it's our goal altogether. So now I would like just first thanks to Fatih Birol, to have launched this Global Commission and the IEA for organizing this event. It's very important. And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Brian Motherway, Head of Energy Efficiency at the IEA. He will moderate the expert panel discussion for the second half of the webinar. Thank you to all, and see you soon somewhere.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Penico, and thank you very much, Dr. Birol. And thanks to all our speakers in the first part, to Sharon, of course, as ever, to Secretary Rivera, to Martha Newton, Shoya Yoshida, and of course, Brad. Thank you very much as well. It's been a great pleasure to hear from you all, and I think those of you watching online will realize we have a lot of common themes coming out in this discussion already. We see a real emphasis on understanding that change is coming, and there will be benefits and there will be challenges. As Dr. Birol said at the start, clean energy transitions are nothing if they're not for and about people, and we need to realize they will bring great benefits in terms of job creation, better quality of life, and of course addressing the worst aspects of climate change. But many people have legitimate and valid and genuine concerns about their own place in these transitions and the place of their livelihoods, of their communities, employment models, of the kind of jobs they and their families have had for many years, often for many generations. And transitions need to robustly and proactively address these issues and be strategic, be long-term, and be inclusive. And in the first half of the discussion, we heard many common themes, I think, around social dialogue, the importance of discussion, around the importance of financing and investment and doing things right in that regard. And of course, the importance of planning around skills, around understanding where jobs can be, about strategically planning to maximize the job creation and particularly looking after communities that may risk negative employment impacts and negative economic impacts as a result of the transitions. And we're going to pick up those themes in the second half now with our really excellent panel. And panelists, I'm really going to ask you to focus on something that actually Sharon, our very first speaker, spoke about, which is about the practical, how to go from principle to practical in this and how to do these things in action. And I really want to hear from your experience about how to make this happen so that it's not just an abstract concept, but we can actually see how the Global Commission can advise governments to get this done on the ground. And joining me on the panel, we have 5 excellent experts and thinkers. We're going to hear from Derek Brouwer, who's the US energy editor of the Financial Times. We're also going to hear from Maria Emaninta, who's the head of the International Department at the Indonesian Workers' Welfare Union. We also, I'm very pleased to say, we're joined by Dave Moxham, who's the Deputy General Secretary of the Scotland Trades Union Congress. Also by Anna Beth Skreda, who's from the Department of Business and Industrial Policy of the Norwegian Confederation of Trade Unions. And a particular pleasure also to welcome Samantha Smith, who's the Director of the Just Transition Centre at the International Trade Union Confederation. So panelists, thank you very much for joining me. I hope we can have a nice discussion. We have 45 minutes, so I hope we can hear from all of you several times in these discussions. So Samantha, I think I'll start with you on this question, if I may, of going from theory to practice. And you obviously see this happening in many parts of the world. Maybe you could start by just giving us a couple of what you think are key points of what we've learned so far as to how we go from principle to practice when we want to make transitions people-centered, we want to protect employment, and we want to make transitions just.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. And it was a great discussion in the previous panels. I'm just going to build on what people have said. The Just Transition Center was set up by ITUC and our affiliates to help unions get good plans for social dialogue. So we are actually working much more on the practical, pointy end of Just Transition. Probably the most important part is, as you can imagine, social dialogue. That workers and our unions are at the table, that we're not just being consulted, but that we're there and able to make decisions, reach binding agreements with employers and with governments. So that is absolutely number one. But number two is that there need to be new jobs, and the new jobs need to be good jobs. Because if the only thing on offer for people, if their jobs are going to change dramatically or maybe even disappear, is that maybe if they're lucky, they're going to get a package at the end of employment. They might be able to go on benefits depending on where they are. They're going to be very fearful and resist change. So just to pick up on Brad Markell's point, it's really important both that unions are at the table, but also that all workers see opportunities for themselves and their families, and that those new jobs are of the same quality as the job that they may have to leave behind. And that just takes us to another point, which is that all the jobs should be good jobs. So not just new jobs in the energy sector, but also jobs that are more traditionally reserved for workers outside the energy sector, like jobs in care. Because there are many ways to support a household income. And one way is to make sure the jobs that traditionally have been held more by women, that those also are good, high quality jobs.
Turn to you next, Dave Moxham, because Scotland has an interesting experience in this regard, of course, with a statutory Just Transition Commission. And maybe you could tell us a bit about that model and what you've learned about how to promote this central theme we're landing on here, which is social dialogue in regard to these issues.
Thanks very much indeed, and good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I've just finished as a member, one of two trade union members on Scotland's Just Transition Commission, which has just reported after 2 years, and I think represents some significant steps forward in terms of promoting social dialogue. The Just Transition Commission was the idea of the Scottish trade union movement, working together with members of the Scottish environmental lobby as well. So it came from where it should have come from, and it was adopted by government, and government is now responding, about to respond to its findings. And what it represents, we think at least, is the potential, because we haven't seen the action yet, but the potential to create a national mission where government leads, but government leads at the behest of social partners, and government takes on the responsibilities around skills, around developing sectoral plans for transition, but is prepared to say that good work is a fundamental ingredient within that. So the formation, the parameters, the players at the table are all right. The next couple of years, it's a question of seeing how we can put that into detailed practice.
Dave, if another country was thinking of following that model, what would you say were the key ingredients of success in the design that you would think would be essential?
So it must be multi-party. It must have environmental and obviously worker interests at the table. It must, of course, have representatives of industry within it, but that must be balanced against a range of other considerations. For instance, we had people concerned with fuel poverty and other social issues on that commission too. So its makeup must represent the overall challenge and the overall opportunity that we face, and that has to be a whole economy and a whole of society view, rather than one which is too narrow in terms of the transition. It must then move onto concrete plans, and concrete plans that are sectorally and place-based, but its starting point must be one where all of the legitimate interests in just transition are at the table.
Thanks, Dave. Annabeth, if you could turn to you next, because obviously Norway is another example of where there's a very interesting societal debate going on at the moment in terms of transition from a resource that has been very central to Norway's economic and social success for many decades, and now facing obviously a low carbon future. Maybe you could tell us a bit about how that context changes the debate or frames the debate in your case.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think that everybody is realizing that we are going to have a fossil phase out at some stage. And of course, we have the debate as every other country, when will this happen? And in the meantime, we need to focus on how to proceed. And what we have seen is that our tripartite cooperation is very fundamental in Norway. We cooperate with government and with the employer side and the workers along. And we have a good tradition of social dialogue when it comes to economic and social policies, and now also on climate policies. What we see is that we are trying to look at the new industries coming along, like carbon capture and storage, which we see as one of the transition opportunities for the people in the petroleum sector. So it's a lot of the same skills, it's a lot of the same competence needed, and there is a really huge market in the future that will need to deposit their captured CO2. And this is something that we could perhaps make a new industry of. So this is something we are working very closely with government and employers through social dialogue on to try to get. Other parts of it is, of course, public procurement that we suggest and demand that when government is having their public procurement out, they should demand that there are rules against social dumping. They should demand that there are collective bargaining agreements. They should demand environmental standards and climate friendly products. And this is one way of pushing the agenda. And then, of course, workplace inspections are things that should follow up. That is very concrete, and where we would suggest that governments go closely in to see that these actions are followed up locally and at the workplace level. So there are many things that we could do that are very concrete actions. But at the same time, I would like to just add in this stage of the debate that Dr. Birol is talking about for and about people, which is great. And I really appreciate IEA going this way and focusing on people. But there is another word that should be there, and that is with. Because for and about is fine, but it should be with people, and it should be with the workers and their representatives. Then you will have a very broad and good dialogue on this. And I think it is Sharon Burrows that says nothing about us without us. And that is also very to the heart of how to build a just transition in this sector. Thank you.
Thanks, Annabeth. And that's a very well-made point about for, about, and with people. Well noted, and I'm going to write that down. Maybe I could turn to Derek Brower next, please. Derek, we chatted recently. I was telling you how much I enjoyed an article you wrote recently in the Financial Times called 7 States, 3,000 Miles, a Trip Across the US Energy Divide. And it really brought home the human dimensions of what we're talking about here in terms of workers, communities, whole regions, thinking about how transition affects them, thinking about the place of energy in their identities and in their cultures as well as in their livelihoods. And you made a point that struck me where you were talking about a community, an indigenous community that has benefited economically from traditional forms of energy. And you said the dispute echoes the broader debate over America's energy sector. Fossil fuels cause harm, but also pay for medical facilities in indigenous communities. So, Derek, what did those conversations teach you?
Thanks, Brian. They taught me a lot, actually, and one of the biggest takeaways I had, I think, was that the conversations that are being had about the energy transition feel very, very distant from Gillette, Wyoming, or Fort Berthold, which is where the indigenous leader that I spoke to and that you referred to there in North Dakota is. And I think people in these communities feel like they are bearing the brunt of discussions that they have no influence over and that are being undertaken by very powerful, very august people without really having much of their input. I agree entirely with what Anne and Beth just said about it needing to be with, the conversation needs to be with these people, because that's really what they feel they don't have, is a voice in these debates. And in these fossil fuel-based communities in the US that I traveled through, I mean, one of the purposes of my trip was to give them a voice and to find out how they feel about the energy transition. And one of the conclusions was that they don't as many of us do in coastal cities in the US or in London or in Oslo or Edinburgh, wherever, they don't, or Paris, they don't fear these people in these communities. They don't fear climate change per se. What they fear is climate change policy, because climate change policy is what will impact their lives. If you are at 2,000 meters in Wyoming, as many of the people I spoke to are, you do not fear rising sea levels, quite frankly. And so the conversation needs somehow to involve them and their fears. And their fears are, as we've all been talking about today, and as the previous speakers all mentioned, are about job losses, and they're about losing the identity of their community. It was striking to me, I'll just leave you with this, it was striking to me that in the Powder River Basin, this huge coal mining area of the US, responsible for 40% of US coal production. In that area, coal has been diminishing in size and in importance, and yet it's still the dominant source of income for the local towns. I think even more than that, it's really the source of their identity. Even though coal is diminishing in a political sense and in an economic sense in these communities, they still identify as coal miners, as people whose livelihood and historical livelihood has depended on coal mining. And so asking them suddenly to pursue coding or to get new jobs in solar or wind, and Wyoming is a big wind power state as well, but asking those things somewhat ignores, I think, how they see themselves. They don't see themselves as a wind-producing state, even though it is one. They see themselves as a coal-producing state, and they've been told for decades that they were responsible for turning the lights on in America, keeping the lights on, and providing this baseload power generation and making the country great. And now they're being told that they don't have a future, that they are villains because they're producing climate-warming fossil fuels, and that they better just go and get a different job. And that hurts.
Derek, I think you're speaking to the core of the issue here, and I doubt if it's just in North Dakota that my job today, my livelihood, the well-being of my community will always be more salient and pressing than what will always unavoidably feel more abstract or far away about future climate. And as you say, in certain cases, it doesn't even feel like it'll affect my locale at any time. I suspect that's quite universal. But how does one get over that? That seems to be like a pretty core structural issue in the climate debate.
Well, it's a good question. I was struggling with that on my trip. I did meet some local voices who are trying to, ex-miners who are now trying to persuade people in Wyoming that they need to get on this. That whether you believe in climate change or not, climate change policy is real, and it's coming down the highway straight at Wyoming. So there are people, local organizers, community organizers, who are trying to spread that message. I think for every local organizer, there is somebody who missteps at the highest level. And the biggest misstep, I have to say, was John Kerry telling oil and gas workers in January that if they couldn't have oil and gas jobs, they should go and get jobs in installing solar panels. That comment from John Kerry came up repeatedly in conversations I had with people on my travels. Spent 2 weeks on the road in the US. It came up unprompted by people who you wouldn't expect to be listening in on a John Kerry press conference. And so I think the messaging from the very top has to be consistent with the messaging that is happening on the ground among community organizers, and that's not happening at the moment. I would say, just very briefly as well, that although unions have an absolutely critical role in that, there are also a lot of mom and pop companies that aren't unionized, workers that, especially in the oil and gas sector, who have already lost their jobs or their businesses have gone bust during the crash last year. But they also need to have some kind of representation, I think, because there are tens of thousands of those kinds of jobs. I'm thinking of welders and pipe fitters in small towns like Bismarck, Williston, North Dakota, and Hobbs, New Mexico. They aren't unionized. They will get some of the benefits thanks to the unions, but they also need to be brought into this fold as well, I would say.
Thank you very much, Derek. Let me turn now to Maria Emaninta. And Maria, thank you very much for joining us from Indonesia. I think it's late in the evening there, so we really appreciate you joining us. And I know that you're part of a discussion on these points in Indonesia. Maybe you could tell us a bit about what are the key debated points at the moment there.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So I'm being honest that I would say that actually I'm not sure yet that the energy transition deliver diverse and good quality job opportunities. It's not in the sense that this clean energy effort has a negative tendency or poses a risk to quality job opportunities. Not about that. But my doubts arise because of the less explanation, the vagueness of the broad scenario that accompanies it, especially considering the negative impact to come. In terms of employment, the first focus for me, for my country, is most for the existing jobs. What will happen to the possibility of jobs that will be lost? A number of workers who will lose their job if the coal mine is closed, for example. For my country in Indonesia, at least 60,000 workers will lose their job at very first stage. What will happen to them? This should be an initial thought before we talk about the emergency of this new and diverse job opportunities. So transition energy scheme 4.0 in my country with the use of digital energy is not yet known. Now it's even preparing to the enter of the 5.0 era. So people don't know the shape clearly, especially the workers. So far only like renewable energy, 8.55% move already to this new renewable energy. It's beautiful, but not now it perfectly. So this should be clear first, because in many talking that creating new jobs, even the green jobs, 5,000 million new jobs, but we will lose 50,000 million jobs. It's not fair. Then after that, something that's clear that we can talk about the second things, the creation of new, diverse and quality job, I think. Actually, this can be all at once, be the answer for the first point. But of course, there must be clarity of these things first. Of course, job creation will come with a number of preconditions, expertise, one of which, in addition to general factors such as fresh graduates, young, available capability of school-based knowledge, even in many multinational companies, requires the empowerment of workers from their country of origin, and it's not a small percentage. For example, some mining companies from China have invested in Indonesia in past 5 years, bringing their workers 50 to 70% if Indonesia is willing to accept their investment. So the rest is dense with general terms, as I mentioned it earlier. So that's why I said DUB is still exists. Therefore, it's very necessary to have very clear arrangement from the beginning, what the scenario is from all sides, and policymakers must provide a balanced portion between the investment business, employment in this case of the decent aspect, and environmental and human protection aspect should be in the center for all this consideration beyond the business commercial, even environmental, because that's the rationale we need to save the earth for human in the future, I suppose. So that's a very big challenge, I think, now for many of countries, especially for developing country and underdeveloped country.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very much for that perspective. Dave, if I could go back to you, if you don't mind, because we've heard a couple of times, and it's quite common in the debate, to think about designing clean energy transitions with skill sets, with existing skill sets and existing workforces, let's say in fossil energy, into new sectors. And Anne-Beth mentioned CCUS, for example. And of course, Scotland is often mentioned as an example here because of its leadership in offshore wind and in renewables in general. So how I presume that's how simplistic or not is it to think about the energy workforce of Scotland moving from certain types of energy to other types of energy? Is it as simple as that?
It's not as simple as that. It should probably be more simple than it has been for us. And I should maybe say for our wider viewers that our Just Transition Commission isn't really a product of success. It's a reaction to failure in terms of the failure of the Scottish economy and successive governments to effect the good transition, certainly when it came to onshore capacity and some major concerns that we've got in terms of affecting transfer from offshore oil and gas to offshore wind technologies, and then CCU and hydrogen down the road. So we sit with the workforce. We have 300,000 jobs in offshore oil and gas, direct, indirect, and implied, and only about 10,000 at the moment in the two wind renewable technologies. But we are told, and there's nothing to suggest that this isn't true, at least in theory, that there are the large proportion of the skills that are attached to offshore oil and gas are transferable, either quickly or with reasonable action. So the potential is there. The failures thus far and the things that have to be addressed are sectoral plans and responsibilities on key employers, particularly offshore oil and gas employers who are looking to transfer directly into offshore wind, to come up with sectoral just transition plans. We've recently advocated, and this has been supported by the Just Transition Commission, skills guarantees for all workers. So all workers should, by government, be given a skills guarantee. You won't often hear a trade unionist talk about less red tape, but fewer blockages for offshore oil and gas workers in terms of the transferability of pre-existing skills. So there are many offshore oil and gas workers who already have really everything that they need in terms of compliance with health and safety to transfer to offshore wind, but far too many barriers for them in terms of charging and time spent in doing that. So there's quite a big piece there to match what should be a not uncomplicated but not impossible task of transferring from an industry which uses many of the same ports, many of the same skills bases, many of the same supply chains, potentially from one to the other. But, as I think we've all been saying, it's now a question of getting down to the brass tacks of how we actually do that. And that's where the interface between the union and the employer is absolutely vital, because government policy is important, but making it real is very often the job of the unions themselves.
Thanks, Dave. Samantha, could I go back to you, please? Because one of the points I think we've discussed here and seen before is that you need this transparent and honest and open debate, and you need long-term planning. You need to recognize that in decades from now, this sector is going to be very different. There are going to be job losses. But as we've heard in a couple of cases here, not least the US, but in many places, even the sense of the need for a transition or the nature of the transition is quite contested. So I presume having an open dialogue about change is that much harder when some people don't even acknowledge the need for change.
Yeah, welcome to my world. So I would say yes and no to that. I mean, when we're working with unions and their members, and by the way, we're working only with federations, unions, and workers from high emitting sectors, so energy, power and mining, oil and gas, heavy industry, and so on, transport, construction, auto. You have a lot of people who do understand that change is coming because they're already feeling it. Like, this isn't an abstract discussion. Coal plants are closing all over the United States, for example. So if you're traveling in coal country or energy country in the US, especially in the wake of the pandemic and the dramatic drop in oil and gas demand, you're going to meet a lot of unemployed people who are pretty unhappy about the change that's come to their industry, but they're not going to tell you that no change is happening. And the same thing is true across energy-linked sectors like auto production. We generally spend rather little time talking about climate change and its impacts, and rather more time talking about what is happening right now, and also bringing in sometimes even employer representatives or experts to talk with unions so that we can together have the same understanding of what's happening in the sector and what are some of the pathways to good new jobs for people who are working in the sector, whether there are members or not. I think that approach of not trying to convince people about climate change if they don't understand how bad it is, we're probably not able to help them with that, but rather to help them with traditional trade union issues and working class issues, so that your rights, if a retrenchment is being threatened, how long is the notice period? How do we get the employer to the table to make them commit to retrain and redeploy you? What about commitments from government on job creation? And most of all, what about the labor standards that might be attached to that? Because I think one part of government action is really pretty key, and that is that, as President Biden has said, every climate plan should be a job plan. And from our perspective, every climate and jobs plan should have labor standards attached to it. So you're not going to get public money or licenses or any of these other concessions without committing to local economic development and good jobs for the people who are going to be building the stuff. So that we find actually that people are convinced when stuff starts to happen. They might be super skeptical at the start, and that's always how it is. But when our people see good jobs come on the table, when they see investment, they see the employers pitch up for collective bargaining, then they become more positive and then start to advocate for more changes going to bring more better jobs and pathways for them and other people in the sector and the community.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Derek, I might go back to you, and because you have this broad experience that, and again, you don't need to put any state or individual or company on the spot, but in the sense of the health of the debates you've been watching and the health of the discourses, have you seen contrasts where you think some people are engaging in a better debate, it's more mature, less polarized? Are there lessons we can learn from how to do debate well? I'm sorry, it's a slightly large question, but what are your thoughts on the difference between good and bad practice in kind of fostering dialogue on these questions?
Well, I think the United States is a particularly fascinating test case in this, because the energy sector and the energy debate, climate change, has become captive to the culture wars there as well. So you decide which side you're on depending on what you might decide on a bunch of other topics. So the debate is very fractious. I do agree with what Samantha said about the best practice is actually people seeing it work for them. I was in Odessa, Texas, which is the heart of the kind of blue collar side of the shale oil industry in Texas. And the biggest investment they've got right now that will employ 3,000 people for a while and then 300 people, bigger than any of the oil investments that's going on right now, is a clean energy project just southwest of Odessa. And I spoke to oil men who were enthralled by this and thought, this is the best thing that's happened to Odessa for a while. So that's just because the proof is in the eating of the pudding. There are jobs being created, there's investment going into the community, people who've lived in that community see it in action. On the other hand, there are coal mines that are still limping along, trying to survive, employing lots of people, and they're watching as the biggest onshore wind farm in the US is erected, which will only employ 100 people when it's done. So we have to be careful with the jobs promises, I think, and when we talk about the energy transition, because on the ground, there is the experience where they see it really happening, but there's also the experience where they see one sector, wind, solar, not providing the same quality or number of jobs as existed in oil and gas or coal. The one thing I would say about the debate is that because it's so fractious in the United States in particular, I think it's really damaging when voices like, for example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez takes this argument outside her main base and tries to talk to, a Wyoming coal miner or Texan or New Mexico shale gas worker, because it comes across as abrasive, comes across as New York speaking down to people they don't understand, and they believe, rightly or wrongly, I'm just representing what they say, what they told me. They believe that they are misunderstood, they're being made villains of the peace, and that they are being almost stitched up by a metropolitan elite. All these cliches that you hear, they're all true. They all spout these cliches about metropolitan elites on the East Coast who are trying to drive them out of business. And so every time the debate is taken forward by very passionate, correct in many respects, people who are advocating for fast change, that we find fixes to the climate crisis, we have to be very careful how that message translates to people on the ground, because we do need, if we all accept that the energy transition needs to happen for existential reasons, we need to bring along those people. We have a moral responsibility to bring along those people as well, because many of them, as we've been saying, will be the same workers we expect to do the job of offshore wind or installing solar panels and so on.
Thanks, Derek. Annabeth, if I could go back to you on a point just that Derek is talking about the quality of jobs and in the transition. Interested in your views from the Norway perspective, whether is this a fear held among workers in Norway that even if there are plenty of jobs in clean energy sectors, that they won't be as well paid or they won't be as good quality as the jobs people know now?
Well, I think that we expect them to be well-paid, organized, and safe jobs, like we have in our society for this energy sector. But I think it is important to address the hopes and confidence that people need to have in the future jobs. And I think governments need to show us that they take workers seriously. And convincing us that there will be decent jobs up ahead in a climate-friendly future. And ways to do that is, of course, to ensure public welfare, social protection, the core of just transition, and like paid sick leave, unemployment benefits, access to health service, access to free education. And we need to see that rights and support for lifelong learning, upskilling, reskilling, that there are realistic opportunities for workers to take part in these upskilling, reskilling activities, so that they won't be left there without any support or any income while they do all this training to adjust to the new future. So that is one thing. And also, I think there's been a mention of just transition commissions or just transition task forces. I think that is a good way forward. That could be a good path for social dialogue in many, many countries. But another thing that I think is important to remind governments of is that when they report on their nationally determined contributions to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, they should also report on how they perform on just transition, how they perform on cooperation and social dialogue, and how they have national plans and work plans, action plans to ensure that just transition is taken seriously and taken care of. This is also at the rock bottom fundament of climate change policies. If you want to have people understanding and contributing, they have to be part of it. And then you should also report on how you perform as a government, taking this seriously.
Thanks very much, Annabeth. Maria, I'd like to come back to you, please, on the question Annabeth raised in her points there about skills, because obviously Indonesia has a very large workforce in coal, a very large resource, but it's also starting to emerge quite quickly in renewable energy, particularly in solar and somewhat in wind. So is there much focus in your debates about the skills for future jobs in emerging parts of the energy sector?
Yes, Brian, that's very serious problems, because the training skills is not yet well managed in Indonesia. Even under the Ministry of Labor, they already have some skill, triple skilling. but it's not yet in supply based on demand. I mean, it is now we are in the scoping phase for a call out, and many of the training skill for the solar panel, for example, but they address it for workers that are not linked to the energy. There are many challenges for more than 50,000 workers that will perhaps losing their job. They're supposed to be in the first line to address this kind of skilling, but no, they never access it. So they provide it for the category of workers that not linked to it. So I think that's still something need to be evaluated, need to be more clear in management of the triple skilling in my country. I mean, I mean those under the Ministry of Labor.
Thanks very much, Maria. Samantha, I was just thinking about the Scottish example, because Annabeth was talking about the role of social commissions. Scotland seems to be a great success story so far. And we see other examples of that. We see it in South Africa. We see it in a number of European countries. We see bits of it here and there. My question is about the scale of dialogue and discussion around this. How local should it be? Is this a global question we can discuss like we're trying to with the Global Commission, or are things so different from town to town in almost the way that Derek found on his drive that you can't generalize? So what's the right scale to be discussing these issues?
Well, I mean, we've already had that discussion in the ILO, right? So we've got this global framework on just transition. We have a lot of labor standards and conventions about workers' right to know or rights to health and safety and fair pay and so on. So, you know, in a sense, the global discussion has already happened and is still happening. As you heard from Sharon, the UN Secretary General is very keen on this issue, wants governments to get together and be accountable for all the nice things that they've said about just transition. And we also have processes going with, you know, big multinational companies where we too would like them to be accountable for all the great things they've said about jobs, just transition, and emissions. Personally, the global rules are really helpful. It is going to be, as we've heard, very different from Indonesia to Norway or the United States or Scotland or Australia, New Zealand. I mean, we work with unions from Brazil all the way over to Norway and Sweden. So it is super different, the context, how you get to where you need to go. You can do, the best case is actually national social dialogue, which might not be the same thing as a task force or a commission, right? So you might have a larger group of people, as Dave described, where you're trying to get consensus and give advice to the government. But at the end of the day, as Dave also said, you have to have social dialogue between unions and employers and often governments in order to hammer out the details of the new jobs, potential closures, and so on. Personally, I think that the scale of investment that we need just in general for not only energy transition, but to bring down emissions across the economy is such that you've got to have national policy, right? Because the ability to tax and to make those kinds of investments usually doesn't sit with municipalities. Having said that, we work also at the city and the subnational, like state and regional level in different countries, and having social dialogue so that climate actions, for example, by the city of Los Angeles or the city of Oslo, are focused on creating good jobs and providing social protection for everybody can be really useful. So we think it has to be at different levels, but the big stuff, maybe the thing that IEA is really most focused on, for that you need national policy, and you need this core concept of social dialogue, in addition to whatever multi-stakeholder engagements you will have to try to build consensus.
Thanks, Samantha. Colleagues, we're almost out of time. I'm just going to ask a couple of quick-fire questions, if I may, to one or two colleagues before we run completely out of time. And I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, but Dave, I was going to ask you just for a quick answer to a question. Thinking about Scotland has been on this journey for quite some time in terms of thinking about its resources and then thinking about transitioning to different type of energy resources. If you think about the last decade, not just the last couple of years with the Commission, but is there anything in particular in terms of advising other governments that you think was very much the right thing to do or very much the wrong thing to do if you could do that decade again?
The wrong thing to do was not develop a coherent industrial strategy, recognising some of the points that Samantha made there. The right thing to do is the belated recognition that that is now absolutely essential and that we do appear to be having some reflection of that change of approach at government, at the corporate level and companies as well. So moving to the point where the big international players are recognising the need to reflect just transition because government has begun to get its act together in terms of industrial policy.
Thanks very much, Dave. And Derek, just a quick question to you in a similar vein. Just in your experience from talking to so many communities, and in our discussion today, we focus on the quality of the debate and maybe its lack of quality in places. But in terms of doing things better, not to have a better discussion, but if there were policy actions you thought either the federal or state level government should take to really try and shift things forward in a positive way, are there any particular things that occur to you that government should act on to try and move things forward better?
Yeah, I think governments need to make some of these communities that will be left behind or could be left behind, make them the focus of explicit investment to help them be part of this and help lead this energy transition. I think I'm in Derbyshire right now, and I look at Mansfield, a town near me where my kids play football. It still is trying to cope with an energy transition in the UK that happened 40 years ago in the 80s when the coal mines were shut. And it has been completely left behind. And the political ramifications for that, in everything from who they vote for, how they vote in a referendum, have been significant. And so if this is going to work, if we are to bring these people along as participants in the energy transition, they need to be made to feel like they and their kids have a genuine role in leading it.
Thank you, Derek. I think that's a good point to end. So Derek, Maria, Dave, Annabeth and Samantha, thank you all so very much indeed for being so generous with your time today, with your thoughts and your expertise, and for the ongoing discussion we're having with all of you. I really appreciate your time, and it's been really inspiring to hear both the sense of your wisdom, but also your commitment to these issues. So thank you very much. And to everyone joining us today, thank you for participating. I do hope you found the event interesting and useful. And just to say, as the IEA continues to work on this issue, and particularly as we work with the Global Commission, as it starts to make its recommendations as an input into COP later this year, we're always very happy to hear from you. So do reach out to us at any time. And in particular, if you go to our website, iea.org, there's an opinion survey you can take specifically as an input into the discussions of the Global Commission. And we'd be very happy to hear from you there or through any other channel. So we will have more events in the coming weeks and months on these topics. We look forward to joining you at all of those. And otherwise, thank you very much for joining us today and have a good day. Thank you.